Can you hear me? Yeah, I think you can. Okay, I'm Ilana Ritov. I don't know if all of you know me, but it is my great pleasure. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor CASS SUNSTEIN. I'll say a few words and then we continue. So CASS is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. CASS SUNSTEIN's research covers various issues in administrative and constitutional law, behavioral law and economics, labor and employment law, and environmental law. SUNSTEIN is a most prolific author. In fact, this is probably an understatement, right? He authored and edited about 30 books and wrote more than 400 articles and book chapters. His articles have been published in prestigious journals in law, philosophy, political science, economics, and psychology. SUNSTEIN's groundbreaking research on the legal implication of behavioral phenomena opened up a whole new field. His paper, for example, Moral Heuristics, published in BBS in 2005, spurred new research on the topic in the psychological community. The remarkable growth and development of experimental behavioral research in the legal domain reflected, among other things, in the establishment of our own Center for Empirical Legal Studies of Decision-Making and the Law is to a great extent due to the important research carried out by CASS SUNSTEIN and his collaborators over the last 2 decades. Unlike many of us academics, SUNSTEIN actually put the theory into practice. Publication of the highly visible and influential book Nudge, Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness, co-authored with Richard Thaler, led to an increased awareness around the world of the importance of choice architecture and the lessons of behavioral science. SUNSTEIN went even further in making the insights obtained through basic research to work for society. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, where he could actually implement those principles and insights in highly important public policies. SUNSTEIN collaborated with prominent researchers in different fields, including psychology, economics, and philosophy. One of his collaborators, with whom he apparently had a especially close collaboration and relationship, was Edna Margalit. I'm happy to invite Professor SUNSTEIN to deliver the third memory lecture for Edna Margalit, entitled Free by Default. But before that, I'd like to invite Edna's daughter, Mira, to read what Edna's other daughter, Ruth, wrote. Ruth lives in New York and couldn't be here today, but Mira will read from a piece Ruth recently wrote about losing her mother. You can find the piece on the New Yorker site. Please.
Thank you. The text is not mine, it's my sister Ruth, and she wrote it for Mother's Day. And it was published on the site of the New Yorker, so you can see the full text. It's a beautiful text, but I omitted a lot of parts that have to do with literary references, so it's a shortened version of sentiments I think we all share. When I was growing up in Israel, there was a short-lived show on television called HaChaverim Shel Yael, Yael's Friends, which featured a peppy girl who introduced short clips acted out by puppets. The actress who played Yael was probably in her 20s, but she was dressed up to look like a child in a flowery dress and pigtails. I loved that program, in which the puppets occasionally crossed into real life and made a mess of Yael's studio. Right before the opening music came on, Yael would look into the camera and fake whisper to the viewers, "Tell your mother to turn up the volume." Once my twin sister and I were settling down on the sofa to watch. My mother overheard this opening bit. "And what about those who don't have a mother?" she asked. I must have been 7 or 8 at the time. I was irritated with her for asking that question, forever ruining the show for me. But I shouldn't have been surprised. It summed up, and I now realize, her parenting philosophy. The way she didn't baby us, but treated us like thoughtful people, capable of empathy. The way she was always fully there, registering and questioning. But mostly, I think, it showed her unyielding belief in fairness, which years later I would hear her define as justice played out in the private sphere. It was a particular kind of fairness, one that centered on a child's sensibility. Once, when I asked her whom she loved more, my sister or me, she answered simply, "You." Incredulous, my sister posed the same question. "Who do you love more, Ima, Ruth or me?" "You," my mother said. We tried again. Each time, my mother invariably told whoever asked that she loved her more. "This doesn't make any sense," we finally said. She smiled and told us, "Sure it does. Don't you see? I love you more, and I love you more." This was her sense of fairness. No kid wants to hear that they are loved the same as their sister. This Mother's Day, 3.5 years after she died, I find myself turning over her question in my mind. And what about those who don't have a mother? "Call Mom," said a sign the other day, and something inside me clenched. In my inbox at work, an email waited from the New York Times, a limited offer to treat Mom to a free gift. It's nothing, I tell myself. A day for advertisers. So I shrug off the sales and the offers, the cards and the flowers. I press delete. Still, I now mark Mother's Day on my private calendar of grief. Anyone who has experienced a loss must have one of those. There's August 29th, my mother's birthday, forever stopped at 64. September 17th, my parents' anniversary, a day on which I now make a point of calling my father, and we both make a point of talking about anything but. There's June 6th, the day she was diagnosed, when a cough that she had told us was annoying her and a leg that she had been dragging, thinking she must have pulled a muscle, turned out to be symptoms of stage 4 lung cancer. And then there's October 16th, the day she died, 4 months and 10 days after her diagnosis. The year becomes a landscape filled with little minds. Megan O'Rourke has a wonderful word for the club of those without mothers. She called us not motherless, but unmothered. It feels right, an ontological word rather than a descriptive one. I had a mother, and now I don't. This is not a characteristic one can affix, like being paperless or odorless. The emphasis should be on absence. They say time heals. It's true that the pain wears off slightly around the edge, like a knife in need of whetting. But there's what they're missing. It gets harder to explain to myself why I haven't seen her. A month can make sense. I took a trip, or she was busy with work. Even 6 months is excusable. I moved. She's on a sabbatical. But how do you make sense of more than 3 years' worth of distance? How to comprehend that time will only drive my mother and me further and further apart? From my mother's favorite Hebrew poem, in which the poet Natan Alterman describes his beloved as sudden forever, pitomit la'ad, those 2 words, as well as the poem's title, A Meeting for Eternity, Gisha le'en ketz, are oxymorons that spell out the contradictions inherent in loss. What is the death of a loved one if not an oxymoron? My mother isn't here, and yet I see her everywhere. I kept on looking for hints of her on the page, as though by reaching her beloved books and poems, I would get to reclaim a part of her that was already slipping away. 2 days before she died, my father walked into the hospital room and told me to time a minute. I took my watch. I looked at my watch. When the minute was up, I told him. He said, 23, very good. He had been counting her breaths, I realized, willing her to stay, and she did. She waited until we were all there, flanking her bed before letting go. We buried her just outside of Jerusalem, on a kibbutz facing the mountains of her youth. She adored her hometown Jerusalem and ached over what it had become. The growing zealotry, the flickering lights of peace, the news coming out of Israel today, another botched round of negotiations, would have depressed her terribly. Instead, I like to think of what is immutable. The warm wind whistling past those hills, the pine needles crackling underfoot. And on the other side of the mountains, down by the coastal plain, hidden, is the sea. Another memory floats by without warning. My mother and me after a dip in the water. My teeth are chattering. My fingers are raisins. I want to rush towards my towel. My mother tells me softly, we don't run to our towels, we walk. That moment distills her essence for me, a hint of old-fashioned formality. A proper woman should know how to carry herself, combined with an implicit imperative. Hold your head high. What's what she was really telling me. Take your time. Soon it won't be cold. There's a word in Hebrew, malkosh, that means last rain. It's a word that only means something in places like Israel, where there's a clear distinction between winter and the long, dry stretch of summer. It's a word, too, that can only be applied in retrospect. When it's raining, you have no way of knowing that the falling drops would be the last ones of the year. But then time goes by, the clouds clear, and you realize that that rain was shower was the one. Having a mother, being mothered, is similar in a way. It's a term that I only fully grasp now, with a thirst of hindsight. Who she was, who I was for her, what she has equipped me with. Like a last rain, my mother left behind an earthy scent that lingered long after she was gone. Like a last rain, for a fleeting moment, everything she touched seemed to glow. Thank you.
Okay, so is the microphone working? Can you hear me? So I knew that this would be read, and I've been blessed to get to know Ruth a bit, and I sent her a note saying, thanks, pal. Yeah, I get to follow you. I don't know how many of you know the Dave Matthews Band. This is an unusual beginning for a talk on rationality, but Dave Matthews is a great rock singer, and his favorite song he wrote many great songs, I hope some of you know that, is called Grace Is Gone. And there's a lot of discussion in rock music. Well, who is Grace about? And I have a candidate who Grace is about. So I got to know Edna because of a conference at the University of Chicago in the 1980s. It was a conference on norms. She had written the book on norms, The Emergence of Norms, which was, a classic almost immediately. And the conference had the world's best on norms. And here was this young law professor, yours truly, and it was a little bit as if there was a conference on bugs, and someone came in thinking that this was about the Volkswagen Beetle and came in to talk about the Beetle. So I came and talked about norms in law, and this wasn't what the conference was about. It was about norms in the sense that Edna's pioneering book explored. And so I gave my little talk on norms and legal interpretation, and there were all the famous great people in the room who I admired so much, and they stared at me, not with revulsion or contempt, but with puzzlement. What do we discuss now? Edna, of course, knew, and with her characteristic quickness, brilliance, and situation sense, thought this is what we'll discuss. We'll discuss norms in law. And she fashioned this into a discussion. Okay, I have three things to say about Edna. One is that she was the most considerate person I ever met. And as a co-author, as a friend, I can't imagine as a mother, as a spouse, as a colleague. She wrote the book, pretty much literally, on considerateness, relatively late in her life. And everything I saw in her writing was exemplified in her person. Notion of considerateness isn't often described as the highest value. Maybe it deserves to be. She defined that characteristic. There's an idea in music, I don't know much about music, but there's an idea that a very small segment of the population has perfect pitch. Some of you probably have relative pitch, where if I sang a note, and you're lucky, I'm not going to sing any note, you would know that's a D, and then you'd be able to say an E. A very small percentage of the population has perfect or absolute pitch. That is, you can pick out an E on the fly. As a human being, and this is the second thing I'll say about Edna, she had perfect pitch in every domain that defined her. The third thing I have to say, at least from my occasional viewing, she had a still center. Hardly anyone has a still center. No human being can have a always still center. Her center was still. I asked her once, how did you handle it with 2 children and then twins? That seems to me unimaginably difficult. She responded this by email with one word: organization. Someone consider it perfect pitch, still centered. She loved a book called Possession. Told me to read a book called Possession, which I gather she reviewed. I know also she taught a course on the meaning of life, and I wish I'd had a chance to talk to her about that course. Maybe some of you did or took the course. I have a little bit of a hunch, which is what she had was a narrative sense. And that the possession, both its kind of delicacy of sensibility and its attunement to particulars and its narrative sense, is connected with what she thought the meaning of life was, I think. Okay, might get a little emotional here. Forgive. My mother died about 20 years ago. That was hard. My daughter, who was at the time 5, something like that, so it was 18 years ago, I said, your grandma died. And said, she's gone. And my daughter said, Dad, she's not. She's here. She's all around you. There's a sense in which that's not true. But here at her beloved Rationality Center, and I can't tell you what it's like for me having mailed so many things here and never having been here to be here, I'm going to go with my daughter on this one. Grace is not gone. Okay, now we have to do a little business. We have to talk about some substantive issues, and this has a link with Edna's amazing work on presumptions, picking versus choosing, and opting. Her work, one little word on her work, it's a series of gems. I don't know if it's diamond or gold, but the papers are a series of gems. And this is building some kind of crude bricks on top of a foundation of gems. That's what you're about to hear, bricks. In Denmark, a bunch of employers have produced big increases in savings through a simple initiative. Make enrollment automatic, subject to opt-out. The result of this initiative has been to increase savings rates very dramatically. In fact, and as a long-time University of Chicago person, I can't believe the sentence I'm about to utter. Automatic enrollment in savings plans has produced larger increases in savings than significant tax incentives. It can't be, said the University of Chicago person. that automatic enrollment subject to costless opt-out has any impact, let alone a bigger impact than significant tax incentives. But the evidence is real. That's a fact. A recent field experiment in Sweden finds that a double-sided default for printing has resulted in a 15% cut in paper consumption, a cut that's staying stable over time. A 10% tax on paper use, by contrast, is projected to produce a 2% drop in paper use. If you want to save some money, do something good for the environment, change the default on your printer to double-sided, if you haven't already. A lot of people have been interested in producing green energy. In Germany, people have said they want green energy. The green energy choice in Germany up until very recently has been trivial, 2%, 3%, with two communities, two outliers in Germany, showing green energy use over 90%. You might think that those are places that have powerful green parties or that have a lot of education / propaganda about the wonderfulness of green energy. It's not so. Kind of through serendipity in those two places, there's a default into green energy, which you can cheaply opt out of, and no one does. In these three cases I've given, and there are countless others, we see that a default rule is massively infecting behavior. It tends to be sticky. What I'm going to try to do in these remarks is to understand the choice among three alternatives: impersonal default rules, that is, mass default rules that fit a big population, as in the three cases given; active choosing, where you get to decide exactly what's going to happen to you with respect to energy or savings or healthcare or privacy or anything else; or the third in our triptych, personalized default rules, where you get a default rule that fits your situation in particular. Maya kindly took me on a pretty amazing tour. Mira took me on an astounding tour of the Israeli Museum. Maya showed me a triptych, and this is going to be a little bit of a triptych among impersonal default rules, active choosing, and personalized default rules, motivated by the thought that more than at any time in the history of the world, it is feasible to ask you, what do you want with respect to anything under the sun? That's active choosing. And more than at any time in the history of the world, it's possible to devise for you, given your own past choices or your demographic characteristics, a default that fits your situation. So those are the two coming things. Okay, here are my organizing claims. First, all three in our triptych are forms of libertarian paternalism. Active choosing, which seems an antonym to any kind of paternalism, is actually a species, sometimes an attractive species, but often not, and almost always one. The reason is that frequently human beings choose not to choose, and if we dishonor that choice by asking them to choose, we're doing so in a way that reflects a paternalistic impulse, which might be the right impulse, but is nonetheless overriding their choice not to choose. So I want to put a spotlight on the fact that in multiple areas, human beings want not to choose, and active choosing is in tension with what they want. I'm going to urge that personalized default rules are a promising kind of nudge, and as science fictional as they seem, they promise to produce gains in terms both of welfare and autonomy. And finally, by way of introductory framework, I want to suggest the choice among personalized default rules, our kind of science fiction coming strategy, active choosing, and mass default rules, as in the three cases with which I began, the choice among these three turns on the cost of decisions and the cost of errors. So that's our Benthamite framework. We're going to give it some John Stuart Mill type qualifications, but we have Benthamite foundations, minimize the cost of decisions and the cost of errors, and use that as a kind of knife that cuts through seemingly difficult dilemmas about what to do. So the world of law and economics, I think, has had only one great idea had a lot of good ideas. It's had one great idea, which is if you're stuck, think about the costs of decisions and costs of errors. And I'm going to try to build on that idea in resolving the question among these three. Okay, I think intuitively those introductory remarks should suggest that impersonal default rules look good when the context is confusing and unfamiliar, when people would prefer not to choose, and when the population's not heterogeneous along any relevant dimension. That's an area where you want an impersonal default rule, maybe for retirement. If it's an area where impersonal default rules are unreliable because the social planner lacks relevant information or isn't trustworthy, because the context is familiar, because there's heterogeneity, or where people actually enjoy choosing, then we have a kind of canonical area for active choosing rather than default rules. The beauty of the personalized default is it promises to overcome the problem of heterogeneity while also reducing the decisional burdens that active choosing imposes on people. So in many contexts, we should opt for personalized default rules because they respect heterogeneity. You're going to get a different default rule from you without forcing people to make a choice which might be burdensome and painful. The problem is the challenge for the fan of the personalized default rule, and this is the million point, is that learning can be really important. And if you want people to build up a kind of stock of knowledge and value, even the personalized default rule is a problem because it doesn't develop a kind of muscle of valuation or knowledge. And that's a point for active choosing. Okay. Nonetheless, personalized default rules are the wave of the future, I'm suggesting, and for good reason. In families, often, one or another member adopts the functional equivalent of a personalized default rule. He or she knows you and knows what you like and chooses for you, and that's a blessing rather than a curse. With respect to restaurants, vacation spots, even conversations, what it means to be a family member, often a friend, is to default people into certain things, subject to opt-out. You can be surprised by your sibling, but default rules are all around, and I'm suggesting they're institutional analogs. Okay, basically that's the text of the talk, but law professors have a lot of footnotes, and you're about to hear the footnotes. Okay, we have to spell out a little bit more what default rules do and why they matter. So let me just give a couple of other examples. In the University of Chicago a few years ago, I did a pretty simple experiment that was designed actually to show that default rules don't matter, because I had University of Chicago instincts. I wanted to prove it was wrong. And so I thought I'd show that there are areas where the default rule isn't going to be sticky. Here's the experiment. I said to a bunch of first-year law students, this is kind of realistic, you're going to be working after graduation for a firm. After graduation, you have, by state law, 2 weeks of vacation that are mandatory. But you can buy 2 weeks of extra vacation and get a total of 4. And the firm won't take it amiss if you buy the 2 extra weeks. How much would you be willing to pay to get the 2 extra weeks? And they had a big salary. So how much would they pay? Then for another large group of law students, I said, you're in a state that has 2 weeks of mandatory vacation time, and by default, 2 extra weeks. How much would the firm have to pay you to get the 2 extra weeks back? And let's stipulate that there's no adverse employment effect that would come from either your buying in the first intervention, the first experiment, you're buying the 2 weeks, or for your selling the first 2 weeks in your second. How much would you pay? And the prediction was the numbers would be the same. It's familiar context. They ought to come up with the same number. Stunningly, the median number for how much would you be willing to pay was $6,000. The median number was how much would you demand was $13,000. And in fact, that $13,000 under-predicted the result because 6 of my population of about 80, so nearly 10% of my law students said, there's no amount that my employer could name that would allow me to give up my vacation time. Okay, powerful effect from the default. In New York, there are now screens for tips where you put your credit card through. I'm using a hand signal so you'll get the image. This is helpful, I know. And then you can put basically 20, 25, or 30 by default, or you can name 15, which used to be the standard. It's pretty easy to name 15, but the default has produced a 10% increase in the tips that are being taken in by New York cab drivers. A simple effect of the default. We know that with respect to personal privacy on the web, the default makes all the difference. If people are defaulted into information sharing, they are unlikely to make the effort to get privacy. If they're defaulted into privacy, they're most unlikely to make the effort to yield it, even if they are told that this will make the web more serviceable for you. And the companies know this. Some of the disputes in Europe, maybe here too, are about the understanding of the power of default. And some of the companies' own settings. On Google Chrome, you can't make it incognito as a general default. You can make it as a one-shot default, and then you have to keep doing it. And it's because the company knows the power of default. Okay, that suggests there are a bunch of domains where the default rule is decisive or important with respect to outcomes. Let's try to get a handle on why that's so. First explanation. In Italy, research shows that if you have a popular TV show, let's say, is Homeland popular here? Homeland came from here. It had better be popular here. You have Homeland followed by a reality show involving former television stars. No one wants that show. So let's just, that's the made-up name of a show that no one wants to watch. Reality show of has-beens. The reality show of has-beens is 10% more popular in Italy because Homeland, the popular show, precedes it. Why is that? It's because of inertia. So frequently the default rule is sticky because of the power of inertia. People don't want to expend the effort that involves some degree of cognition and time to change the default. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two is endorsement. If there is a default rule involving saving for retirement, you might well think that someone who's intelligent and knowledgeable has decided that you ought to be saving for retirement. If there's a default that's privacy protective, you might think that there's some privacy protective value that someone who has your interest at stake is speaking for, and you shouldn't reject it unless you have personal information that would allow you to overcome it. That's to say that the default rule has some signaling content in it, and that matters. Now there's a little wrinkle here, which is that there's incipient but powerful evidence that automatic enrollment is informationally rich, but non-enrollment isn't. People don't take it as a signal. So there's an asymmetry. If you're automatically enrolled in a plan, people take it as a suggestion that that's the good thing to do. If you're not automatically enrolled, they don't take it as a signal that that's the right thing to do. And then in the latter case, the stickiness of the default is purely a product of the power of inertia, not about information signaling. Okay, the third explanation I think is the most interesting, and I'm going to sneak up on it a little bit. There's a study of teachers in the United States which notices the fact that economic incentives for improved math scores don't really work. Now that's itself a puzzling finding. If you tell teachers if the scores go up at the end of the year, you get extra money, that doesn't have any impact. It should. It doesn't. But, and here's the study, if you tell teachers, here's a bunch of money, if the students' math scores don't go up at the end of the year, you have to give it back, then the math scores jump up. They don't want to give the money back. Golf. Do you all know what a birdie is and a putt and a par? Okay, for the non-golfers in the room, I'll explain this a little bit. A par is what a great golfer is supposed to do, or a very good golfer. If you do better than that, it's called a birdie. That's beautiful. If you do one stroke worse than that, that's a bogey. That's bad. Now, in terms of golf scores, a putt is a putt, and it should a stroke is a stroke, and a birdie is not more good than a bogey is bad. They're equal. Professional golfers do better putting for par than they do putting for birdie. That shouldn't happen. If professional golfers putted as well for birdie as they putted for par, they'd make a lot more money. Now, I think the teacher study and the golf study are exactly the same study. It's that people are averse to losses. They hate losses from a status quo. And just like the teachers don't want to give up the money they had and don't care so much. I mean, Danny Kahneman, of course, has explored this in prospect theory. It really matters. Now, the point for default rules is the default rule establishes the reference point to determines whether it's a loss or a gain. So if you're told some of your money is going into savings, some is in take-home pay, do you want the savings money to go into take-home pay? You say, no, I don't want to lose my savings. But if it's going into salary, and then you're asked, do you want it to go into take-home, into savings? You say, no, I don't want to lose some of my salary. So what is a reference point matters. Okay, this is why default rules are sticky. There are some areas where there aren't, and I want to get a little handle on two different categories where default rules don't stick. One is where people have clear antecedent preferences against the default rule. So in some countries, here's one default rule that turns out not to be sticky. I think it's a particularly interesting one. Marital names for women. In the United States, when you get married, you keep your name. Men don't change their name, by and large. Women do, by and large, change their name. The default rule in that case is not sticky. The reason is that there's a clear antecedent preference to change the name. Timing is visible and plain. It's at the point of marriage. And the change, far from being the expenditure of an effort tax, it's a kind of celebration of a happy event. So if you have those three ingredients, clear timing, clear antecedent preference, and celebration of the overcoming of the default rule, then the default rule is not going to stick. Actually, I think the analysis of non-sticky default rules is a little simpler than that. And here's the evidence that I think is profound about human beings. In the OECD, they turned temperature down 1 degree C to change energy as the default setting on the thermometer. People could turn it up, but they turned it down 1 degree C. The effect of turning it down 1 degree C was significant. They saved a lot of money, and it was environmentally good. They also, randomized group, turned it down for a bunch of other people 2 degrees C. Much less of an effect. People turned it right up in winter. They didn't want to be cold. So I think the upshot of that finding is that people will stick with the default unless it makes them really cold. And that suggests default rules will turn out to slip in cases where there's a strong preference not to be in the situation that the default rule pushes you in. Okay, there's another little trick here in terms of slippery default rules that doesn't involve antecedent preferences, but involves the incentives of the people who are subject to the default rule. And I have to give an example to explain this. Our Federal Reserve Board in the United States a few years ago, impressed by the evidence of the power and stickiness of automatic enrollment in retirement plans, thought we have a problem, which is that people are automatically enrolled in what's called an overdraft payment program, by which if you overdraft your checking account, you have to pay high interest loans, and you're automatically in the program unless you opt out. What this meant was that many Americans ended up in a loan program. They were paying up to 7,000% on their so-called loan. And what the Federal Reserve thought as a remedy, oh, we'll just say that people have to opt in to the program. They can't be automatically enrolled. And they thought that's going to be really sticky. No one's going to opt in. Turned out a lot of people did opt in. And the reason is that the institutions, the banks on whom the new default were enrolled, were unhappy with the change, and they were very agile at using behaviorally informed strategies to try to get people to opt in. So, for example, they sent notices out to people saying, please check one of the two boxes. Yes, I want to keep my current protection against overdrafts. No, I want to lose the overdraft protection that I've long enjoyed. putting loss aversion right in the framework of people's heads, and that got them to opt in. Okay, so the suggestion is that where there's a strong antecedent preference and where there's an incentive on an institution who's burdened, then the default rule won't be effective. Okay, now that can be an important safeguard. Okay, which default rule do we want to choose, supposing that we're thinking of impersonal ones? We could get theoretically very ambitious here and think about whether welfare or autonomy is our guide. We could start to think foundational accounts of the legitimate role of the state. John Rawls had a footnote in the manuscript. He published the manuscript as a restatement of a theory of justice. He never published the footnote. I wish he had. It said, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. And so my suggestion is we bracket the deeper issues and select a framework which says we should ask what informed choosers would select. And that's the way we figure out what our default rule is. Whether our operating theory involves welfare or autonomy or something else, the informed chooser approach is likely to give us a good framework. Okay, that's the first part of the triptych. I've tried to explain is why default rules matter, when they turn out not to stick. Their non-stickiness may be a wonderful thing because it suggests that we haven't cabined people in contexts in which the cabining would be harmful to their welfare or autonomy. Or it may be not so good if they're opting out for inadequate reasons. Informed chooser defaults should be a safeguard against that. Okay, one thing I personally have been quite surprised by, both in government and in academic life, after the publication of Nudge, is the extent to which there's a rebellion from the standpoint of active choosing. So there's an idea, I think it has a lot of salience all over the world, which is that nudge approaches are troublesome because there's an alternative, which is active choosing, which is more likely to protect people's welfare and more likely to respect their dignity. So instead of, in the cases I've given, giving people a default rule for retirement or healthcare or privacy, you can just tell them they have to choose, active choosing, sometimes called required choosing. Okay, you could do that, and you could predict that it would have big effects. But there are three things that complicate, I think, even the analysis of whether it's a good desirable. It's kind of conceptual. What does it mean to require people to indicate their preferences? What does that sentence suggest? It doesn't suggest that the structure of the universe is going to explode if they don't indicate their preferences. It doesn't suggest that they're going to jail if they don't indicate their preferences. What does it mean exactly to require their preferences? I think the answer has to be that active choosing works only if there's a default that kicks in if they don't choose. So in that sense, default rules have to be a backstop against active choosing. For example, suppose someone doesn't indicate their preferences with respect to their energy source. They don't say if it's coal or solar or wind or nuclear. They just don't say. Then what happens if they don't say? There has to be some kind of default, even if it's that they don't get energy. I think what is meant by those who want active choosing is that unless people indicate their view about some X, something so severe and terrible is going to happen to them, not criminalization, but so severe and terrible that they're just going to have to bite the bullet and decide. As in saying, unless people indicate their preferences for organ donation, they can't get a driver's license. Or unless people indicate what they want for health care or retirement or privacy, they can't work at a certain employer. Okay, so that I think is what active choosing means. So that's the solution to that complication. Okay, the second problem, as noted, is that active choosing itself overrides people's considered judgments in some contexts that they don't want to choose. It requires them to choose in situations in which they'd prefer not to. And if people have a choice not to choose, forcing them to do so runs into the same objections from the standpoint of paternalism as any other nudge does, doesn't it? So that suggests that if you ask people to choose in situations in which they don't want to, there are two possibilities. One is you're engaging in libertarian paternalism, and the other is you're engaging in a form of coercion. If you're saying to the people who don't want to choose, we want you to choose, but if you don't, you can select a default, then it's active choosing as libertarian paternalism. If you're saying to people, you must choose or you can't work here, you got a driver's license, then it's closer to coercive paternalism. Okay, so this is just a suggestion. We're talking with respect to active choosing. Within the family of nudging, we're not talking about an external objection to nudging. Active choosing is a form of choice architecture, and it's a nudge and often a most unwelcome one. Okay, let's put that to one side, and now what I'm going to do is to try to climb up a hill a little bit, where the hill is why active choosing is wonderful, and then climb down it and suggest why the victory I'm attempting to portray for active choosers isn't quite successful. Okay, the first point is because active choosing is requiring a decision, it overcomes inertia like that. It has the big advantage of ensuring that people aren't stuck in a possibly unsatisfactory status quo just because they're not attending to the problem. So think, for example, of organ donation, where many countries are debating whether we should have presumed consent and opt-out, or instead a system of opt-in, like I gather you have here. One view is that opt-out runs against religious or other objections, which either are plausible or at least sufficiently weighty that they deserve respect. And if that's the case, then we might say, let's have active choosing, when people will often say yes, but they won't inadvertently find themselves organ donors. So active choosing has an advantage of overcoming inertia immediately. It's also a safeguard against both uninformed and self-interested choice architects. So I think we should have two pictures in our heads. I don't quite remember what they both look like, though some of you will. One is Friedrich Hayek and the other is James Buchanan. So Hayek's emphasis was on the knowledge problem, that government doesn't know things that individuals do. And Buchanan's was on the public choice problem, that is the motivations of government officials are often developed by reference to the interests of well-organized private groups. If you think the public choice problem or the knowledge problem is serious, you might want active choosing rather than a default rule. You might also think that active choosing is really good because it appropriately handles diversity. And here the idea on behalf of active choosing is that if there's heterogeneity, the impersonal default rule, as we've discussed, is just going to miss the mark too often, and active choosing will ensure that you have more accuracy. Okay, I want to make one additional point, which is Mill's arguments for liberty emphasized that choice making is like a muscle, and if you don't exercise it, it atrophies. And there's some empirical evidence for this that is a little bit harmful to the cause of libertarian paternalism. Let me explain that a bit, which is libertarian paternalism often sees the GPS as kind of canonical, where the GPS gives you guidance to get where you want to go, but you can ignore it if you don't like it. And we can think of government often as a liberty-respecting GPS if it's being helpful, or a private institution also. Okay, here's the evidence that's not so good. London cab drivers, it turns out, have some neurological development that reflects the fact that they're navigating the streets of London. The brain is altered by the fact that they now understand how the roads go. If they were using the GPS, they wouldn't have that development. And that can be seen as a metaphor for why active choosing has an advantage over default rules. It builds up a kind of capital stock. And even an accurate default rule that doesn't run into an objection of heterogeneity runs into this particular problem. Okay, so now we have a constellation of reasons involving distrust of choice architect, the development of learning, respect for heterogeneity that support active choosing. That's up the hill in our second part of the triptych. Okay, here's a way I want to get into the problem with active choosing, which I think is greatly oversold, and a glance at life suggests why. But I'm going to get at it by talking about the problem of poverty. There's an MIT economist named Esther Duflo who has a lot of knowledge of behavioral economics, who in some oral remarks about poverty said the following: we tend to be patronizing about the poor in a very specific sense, which is we tend to think, why don't they take more responsibility for their lives? And what we are forgetting is that the richer you are, the less responsibility you need to take for your own life, because everything is taken care for you. And the poorer you are, the more you have to be responsible for everything about your life. Stop berating people for not being responsible and start to think instead of ways of providing the poor with the luxury that we all have, which is that a lot of decisions are taken for us. If we do nothing, we are on the right track. For most of the poor, if they do nothing, they are on the wrong track. Okay, it's the last two sentences that I want to emphasize, and Duflo's suggestion is that there are default rules typically that make life padded for most people in well-functioning societies, which means that there's mental space to devote our energies to the things that we really care about. Okay, so the idea here would be, from the standpoint of welfare, people are a lot better off with a network of default rules that make life easily navigable, and less self-evidently, the same is true from the standpoint of autonomy. If we had to develop default rules through active choosing ourselves, or develop outcomes for ourselves with respect to the full network of things that each of us is going to encounter in the next 24 hours, we'd quickly be overridden. And that's freedom friendly. That's the sense in which people are free by default by virtue of sensible default rules. Okay, if we want to particularize this point and kind of bring it home to the default rule question, the problem is that for choosers themselves, active choosing imposes large decisional burdens which are often unwelcome. Imagine, for example, that when you got your tablet, Maya has a new iPad, which she describes as a miracle of science fiction. Imagine that Maya had to develop all the default settings on the iPad. She probably would still be in the store if she had not left in frustration. When each of us starts employment, there's a set of default settings, effectively, that apply to our relations with our employer, and if we had to develop them, that would be immensely frustrating. It's also the case that active choosing can increase errors. That is, in a situation that's familiar and technical, the fact that we are favored by a default rule that we don't have to worry over is very much in our interests. So this is just a way of suggesting that the constellation of considerations, I think it was a quintet, that argue for active choosing are met by some considerations that cut the other way, and the framework that helps us to decide which considerations are convincing depend on decision costs and error costs. That's what they're reducible to. Okay, what we are seeing emerging is the design of personalized default rules, which have a high degree of heterogeneity. So with websites that give your travel preferences, or with maybe your healthcare plan or retirement plan, there are personalized choices now being made in developed countries which people themselves aren't involved in, though they can opt out if they like. When I returned to Harvard, they defaulted me into a retirement plan that fit what they thought about me, and to investigate that would be, for most new employees at Harvard, not a lot of fun, and it might well lead to mistakes. So personalization of defaults is the category I'm trying to describe. Okay, we can subdivide this into some, I think, interestingly different categories. Do you know the website Pandora? Is that familiar? Okay, I'll tell you about the Pandora model. If you put in music that you like, let's say you like Bob Dylan, and you should. You put in Bob Dylan, then you have a Bob Dylan station, which has Bob Dylan songs and songs that are harmonically like Bob Dylan. It's your radio station, and it's based not on any wisdom of crowds inquiry, but instead on what is harmonically similar according to experts who know, I think it's called the Music Genome Project. And you can imagine something like this, where people would say, given a single choice you've made, or given what's known about you, the experts will devise a set of things for you. And actually, Pandora itself could get very ambitious if it wants, and maybe it's starting to, knowing if you like certain kinds of music, there are certain political ads to which you're going to be highly sympathetic, and others that you're going to hate, and it can tailor a lot for you with a non-trivial degree of accuracy. And that's the Pandora model of personalization. There's another model which Amazon has, and I think we're going to see a lot more of, which isn't about expert judgment, but which is instead about what people like you like. So if you like The Emergence of Norms, Edna's astounding book, there's not a lot like that. But there's some. There's a new book on norms by Bob Gooden and others. You'll probably like that too. If you like Avishai's Decent Society book, and you'd better, there are a bunch of books that you're going to like that are not as good as that one, but maybe in the same universe of inquiry at least. And so, they will know that not through the Pandora model, but by what people like you like. In both the Pandora case and in the Amazon case, they're building up from a particular choice that you've made. It's possible, actually, to do that based on extrapolations, not from your choices, but from other characteristics of you, such as demographic characteristics. When retirement plans are personalized, it's not based on choices, it's based on what's known. And those are two different models. I think I'll just mention parenthetically, I've done a little empirical work on these issues myself, on personalization, and at least American populations provisionally are very upbeat. They're very excited, or maybe that's too strong, positive, about the idea of personalized purchases with respect to household goods. So if you have purchased some things, for you to be automatically enrolled into a program by which those things come once you've run out, people like that. They don't like it for books. The idea that you will automatically get books that are like the books you like, people don't like that, even if the algorithm is extraordinarily accurate. Now, it's intriguing to think, why don't people like the book personalized defaults? Is it A, because they don't trust the algorithm and they think they're going to be giving you books that are not what you like? Or B, is it because they think that book search is actually fun and an intrinsic good, or maybe an instrumental good, and household good search is neither an instrumental nor an intrinsic good? Those are both, I think, generally revealing objections to personalization that help give content to the preference for active choosing in cases in which choice is an intrinsic or instrumental good, or in which the personalizer is untrustworthy. Okay, here are two objections. I think they are the two objections to personalized default rules. The first is, to make them good, there has to be a lot of information acquired, and that's maybe not feasible in some contexts. So to figure out what you want with respect to X, Y, and Z based on your choices might risk inaccuracy or self-interest. So you might think that the information acquisition is too challenging and it's likely to be compromised by irrelevant considerations. So that's one objection. I think with the rise of data acquisition, the feasibility objection is going to become less interesting over time, and the likelihood of accuracy is going to jump. The second objection involves privacy. where the idea is for them to know what you like with respect to books or household appliances or even health stuff compromises your interest in keeping your information to you. Now, I think this objection to personalization, which is not an objection to the mass default, has to make a distinction between cases in which you have voluntarily provided information to someone, knowing and not hating that they're going to use it and keep it. That's maybe the Amazon case. And a different kind of case where the person who is personalizing with respect to you isn't someone to whom you've given voluntarily any information, but to whom you've inadvertently given information, or to whom, e.g., Amazon has given information. That's more objectionable. Okay, here's an attempted solution to the problem of privacy. Let's have personalized default rules with respect to that too. If the feasibility objection can be met, then the personalizers will probably know whether the people for whom they are trying to personalize care about privacy in this context or not, and they can build on that. So they may know these people are privacy files, P-H-I-L-E-S. They really like privacy. So we're not going to personalize with respect to them. They want to keep their information secret. But these others are privacy neutral. They don't care. And we'll personalize for them. And there the idea is that that is an entryway into solving the problem of privacy while also having personalization. If you don't like that, then here's another way of solving the privacy problem of personalization. Ask people, active choosing, at least at the outset, or maybe on an occasionally iterated basis, do you want privacy with respect to this or not? We'll personalize for you. If you don't, if you like privacy, we won't personalize for you. You can just use that, active choices, as an entryway into personalization. Okay, it's time to conclude. The point about the omnipresence of default rules is meant to be an objection to active choosing enthusiasm run amok. That's not feasible in this world. They establish settings for countless activities and services, rental car agreements, savings plans, health insurance, energy use, lots more. We have three options: impersonal defaults, active choosing, personalized defaults. These are the bricks I'm trying to lay on top of Edna's work on presumptions and picking and choosing and opting. The question involves the costs of decisions and the costs of errors. Her claim for picking rather than choosing reflects the fact that picking has very low, effectively no, decision costs, and the risk of error by hypothesis is very low because you can't choose because reasons don't really matter. That's a decision cost, error cost situation. Just pick the cereal. Don't drive yourself crazy and choose. So too, that can be our little engine here. Okay, to bring this point to the ground, and that's what I'm about to do, when the relevant group isn't diverse, when an impersonal default rule is going to satisfy the group's informed preferences, it's probably best to select that default rule rather than to require active choosing. If the underlying issue is complex and unfamiliar, active choosing is going to be a burden rather than a benefit, and institutions should run away from it. When the group is relevantly diverse, when choosing is actually fun or valuable, when private or public institutions are untrustworthy or lack good information, then active choosing has big advantages. That's the menu approach to institutional life. When you go to a restaurant, you have a menu, and it's often going to work best. Personalized default rules reduce the problems associated with one-size-fits-all defaults and so provide most of the benefits of active choosing, at least if the relevant choice architects are informed and trustworthy, with the only important qualification being that if it's an area where learning and the development of values and preferences is important, think maybe of selecting your spouse rather than being defaulted into a spouse. those are cases where we don't want even the personalized default rule because we want that capital stock to be built out. Said the happily married and once divorced speaker. Okay, in many domains, and this is the final word, personalized default rules are the wave of the future, and we should expect to see a significant increase in personalization, and we should welcome it as more information becomes available about the informed choices of diverse people who will, as a result, be freer by default. Thanks.
I'm the current director of the center. I just want to use this opportunity to thank again CASS SUNSTEIN for his interesting talk. I'm an economist, not a Chicago economist, and I found it very interesting and relevant. And also want to use this opportunity to thank those who helped us organize this event. I'm just mentioning one name, that's going to be Maya Bar Hillel. So thank you.